Hello everybody and welcome to the Caroline Cymru revision sessions. The session this evening will focus on History AS level and will be presented by Andrew Morell from Llanidloes High School. The session will last around 45 minutes where Andrew will run through the relevant content. If you have any questions during the session, please use the questions and answer section and we'll do our best to answer your questions. You will see there's a hyperlink in the Q&A section as well. If you're happy to leave your name and email address, we would love to keep in touch with you so that we can send you information about future events. You can click on the link at any time during the session. Today's session will be recorded and the recording and any relevant resources will be uploaded to the e-sgol website under the Caroline Cymru tab. Thank you. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Karen. So this afternoon then, what we're going to do is we're going to look at option 8 of our unit 1 and the story of Italy. So one section of that option 8. Option 8 is the most commonly taught option across Wales. So hopefully this is relevant to quite a lot of you out there. A bit of revision, I suppose, a bit of content revision. And before then, next week, as you can see from the timetable of sessions, what we'll do is we'll review a good Italy essay. And obviously the skills and the way that that's set out will apply across any of the units, any of the options within Unit 1 and any of the topics within Option 8 as well. So let's get started. This is the specification for the for Option 8, Europe in the I just forgot the name of it. Apologies at the moment. Anyway, Italy, as you can see, the focus of Italy is the extent of political, social and economic change between 1918 and 1945. And there are 4 main bullet points of content to cover within that. So the main threats to the stability of a liberal government in Italy after 1918, reasons for the establishment of the dictatorship in Italy in 1920s, obviously the dictatorship of Mussolini, the impact of fascist domestic policies on Italy, and the effectiveness of resistance and opposition in fascist Italy. Now, what I'll do essentially is I'm going to tell you the story with some questions, hopefully to get you thinking of the first 3 of those bullet points there. So we'll start right at the beginning. Now, what we have to know, we have to remember with Italy is that Italy was only unified into one country in 1871. Before 1871, as you can see on this map of Italy in 1850, it was made up of a number of different kingdoms, duchies, republics. You can see the Republic of Venice, maybe the Kingdom of Naples, the Duchy of Savoy. It wasn't a country that was called Italy. So in 1871, it was united together into one country. It was one country politically, but there are massive, massive problems with this because did it exist as a nation? Did people feel in their hearts Italian rather than just knowing they're part of an Italian country? Now, of this new Italy in 1871, what we call a liberal government was set up. Now, what it means to be a liberal government is that it advocates for the freedom of the individual, it guarantees individual rights, and it relies on a parliament to make decisions that is elected. Now, their definition of how many people vote in those elections changes, as we'll see, another problem that will face liberal Italy. But nonetheless, those are the key things that make it a liberal government, as opposed to, say, Mussolini's fascist regime, where it wouldn't be freedom of individual, where there wouldn't be a guarantee of individual rights, and there isn't a parliament to make those decisions. Nonetheless, this government had massive pressures against it. And the first problem, really, or the first focus of these problems, is economic. Industry in the South had been harmed significantly by the abolishing of tariffs. As in before 1871, as products moved up between those different republics, different duchies, they could charge tariffs, a tax on those goods that are moving back and forth. So as soon as they abolished those taxes, it meant actually it was cheaper and easier to make things in the north and not in the south. And with it, jobs get lost in the south, etc., etc. Balancing the budget was a massive, massive issue. And it was interesting that they prioritised the balancing of the budget over the balancing of the wealth. They prioritised balancing the budget, the government spending as much as it had, rather than whether or not those in the south could be made a little bit richer to make it a little bit equal between north and south. And for the ordinary Italian, for the Mr. and Mrs. Italian on the street, the taxes were the highest in Europe. Now that has an impact, doesn't it? It has an impact on whether or not you actually subscribe to that state, because it's taxing me more, it should be providing me with more facilities. It also has an impact on your wallet as well, the food, the house you can put over your head, etc. There were some big social problems. The Catholic Church, of which Italy used to be the papal state, controlled and owned by the Catholic Church. It still had huge sway over people's opinions, and it changed their patterns of life. Their pattern of life was shaped by the church, not by being part of the Italian nation. At the same time, literacy rates saw a huge increase. Now you might think that's a brilliant thing, surely, people being able to read, being able to write. But what it does, it means they're more easily able to read and even more easily able to write criticisms of the government, criticisms of the current system as well. Politically, there are some big problems. The Italian people were largely uninvolved in that state, largely uninvolved in that parliament, in that government. And that's because liberal politicians didn't think that ordinary people were able to participate in the state. And able being italicized there for a key reason, right? This is what they talked about at the time. They weren't clever enough, they weren't bright enough, they weren't able to make decisions. And corruption happens in every state, every government to some extent, but seemingly in the Italian government at this time, corruption was big. And what that does is it undermines confidence in the government, creating a big problem. And there was, as I said a minute ago, there was a gulf between what we consider legal Italy, Italy in people's minds, I am Italian, and the real Italy, the Italy in people's hearts. I subscribe to the Italian nation, I feel Italian. So there are clear problems for the Italian government, which is something that they've got to be careful of as they're moving forward, trying to solve the problems, particularly as we'll see after the First World War. So this is the structure of that liberal government. Right at the top sits the king, who was a hereditary monarch. He was king by virtue of the fact his father before him was king. Underneath him sat the government with a prime minister, cabinet ministers, very like the British political system as well. They must have had confidence from Parliament and also the Senate. Now that Chamber of Deputies and the Senate work very, very similarly to our House of Commons and our House of Lords. House of Commons elected, just like the Chamber of Deputies. Senate appointed for life, just like our Lords are appointed for life as well. And these people in Parliament, and in turn then people in the government, were elected by the Italian people. Now initially, in 1871, when this was made one country, that was just 2% of the Italian population. Just 2%. So you can see why some people didn't think that they had an Italy in their hearts, and some even an Italy in their minds, because they weren't really involved in that decision-making process. And the church, they were crucial to influencing people's opinions really at this time as well. So who was the king? Well, the king was this man here, King Victor Emmanuel III, and he was king for a very long time, actually, from 1900 to 1946. And he was, crucially, the only form of stability that Italy enjoyed politically, really from about 1900 until Mussolini took over in 1922. Prime ministers came and went. Between 1900 and 1918, there were 13 different prime ministers, whilst King Victor Emmanuel remained the same, remained that stable figure. And he was part, though, of a wider European trend. You see it in Britain at the time, you see it in Germany at the time, you see it in Spain at the time, of monarchy still existing, but holding less and less power. And ultimately, he was a shy, he was a withdrawn individual, but he wished to see Italy as a major country, one that had big moves and steps to make in Europe, if not the world as well. So he himself, he personally didn't like the instability of the turnover of 13 prime ministers. The government then, that group situated underneath the king, it relied on Parliament to pass laws and enforce the Prime Minister and the King's will. The unification of Italy from 1850 was viewed at the time in two different ways. One, as a national triumph of popular feeling, People coming together as Italy, no longer seeing themselves, or no longer paying allegiance to the Republic of Savoy, instead coming to see themselves allegiant to Italy. And some people saw it as a product of political dealings and French interference. Obviously, the second of these is going to cause big problems for that new government, because what it means is people are thinking foreign agitators are involved, and this isn't really being made for my, an Italian, benefit. And De Azeglio, government minister in 1861, famously said, we have made Italy, now we need to make Italians. And that difference is really, really important. Italy is the state, Italian is that feeling of being part of that Italian state. And that is, although we were speaking 1861, that is a problem that rumbles on and on and on and on, and to some extent is something that Mussolini capitalizes on. So in order to build a kind of Italian feel, it relied on domestic and foreign policy successes. There was no better way of generating people's support for a government than policy success. However, that Liberal government inherited a number of problems that they were too weak to tackle, or frankly too unmotivated to do so as well. The government had an inferiority complex and was militarily weak. Economically, it had a huge debt and a large divide between North and South. Now, it was too weak to address many of these issues, and in some cases, particularly in that wealth divide between North and South, unmotivated to do anything about it. They weren't relying on the votes from the South to be in power, because at first, at least, it was only 2% of the people that voted. Now, they tried to overcome these issues by a nationalist foreign policy agenda, and that was called Italia Irredenta. What they wanted to do, essentially, was claim back unredeemed land on the northeast border, but it wasn't strong enough to them, not strong enough to them as being able to grab it themselves. Imperial expansion, just like Britain was doing overseas, just like Germany was doing overseas, just like Belgium was doing overseas. They tried to take Tunisia and Abyssinia, current day Ethiopia, in what's called now the Battle of Adwa in 1896, but they failed to take them. And so what it does is it makes the people in Italy not associate their government with success, instead they associate it with problems instead. So that's before the First World War. The new country had spectacularly failed to use that international climate to bolster the new country, to make people feel Italian. And this is that map of Italia Irredenta. You can see those red areas of land there that they presumed, they felt should be part of Italy, should have been part of Italy ever since the unification in 1871. Underneath then, you've got your king, you've got your government, underneath it your parliament, and your prefects at the bottom. Parliament, well, it was only in 1918 all men in Italy had the right to vote. Before 1918, not all of them did. So that comes again with those psychological problems of not being invested in that government, not feeling like you have a say. And in fact, turnout in the 1919 election was around about 60%. So 40% of those people, probably newly granted the vote, didn't get involved in that process because maybe they thought it wasn't something for them. They weren't going to be listened to anyway. So the parliament, initially at least, was only chosen by a wealthy and educated elite. And people then perceived its priority as strengthening the military and not equalising that rich and poor divide, that north-south divide. And so really, only a few people were involved in this new Italian government, and it creates problems, as I said, for creating an Italy of the heart. Prefects then, prefects are the equivalent to your local county councils, I suppose. If you think about Wales, Paris County Council, Caerphilly County Council, etc. These prefects were appointed by the central government and controlled the provinces. Now, they didn't have accountability to local people because they weren't voted in by local people. They're voted in by, or they're appointed by the government, who were voted in by only 2% of the richest. So what it meant was there was a fair amount of corruption, and they often took very little notice what the local people wanted. They didn't feel they needed to please those local people in order to rely on their job the next time the election came around, because they weren't elected. And the last two groups then, importantly, the church. Before 1871, the Pope had ruled those papal states that covered most of central Italy. So when Italy was unified, he denounced that new state as a result. He said Catholics shouldn't take part in that Italian state. And in 1874, he took it so far as to instruct them not to take part in elections. And so, at a time when 95% of the people were devout Catholics, it's going to have a bit of an impact. Priests in the pulpit every Sunday would reinforce this message. The vast majority, 95% of people in Italy were Catholic. They'd go to church every Sunday. They'd hear that message from the priest that Italy shouldn't be a thing. They shouldn't engage in that new state. By 1904, the Pope had kind of softened a little bit and he was worried about socialism. So he did allow Catholics to vote so long as they kept the socialists out. So he wasn't suggesting they vote because this new Italy is a great thing and is the way forward in order to sustain a religious community and a nation. It was to keep the socialists out. And the people, well, by 1900, the poor of Italy were the highest tax in Europe, as I said. The money wasn't spent on them, but expanding the military, paying off that unification debt. A unification that they didn't see benefits from. They did provide freedom of speech, religion, some education, but what was the point in freedom of speech? What was the point in education if you couldn't use it to influence the government, if you couldn't use it for your vote? And so what you see is between 1876 and 1926, in that 50-year period, 17 million Italians emigrated. That's not just a few wandering off to another country because there's a better job. That is people leaving hand over fist because they're not happy with what's happening in Italy. So you can see the seeds of doubt are sowed as to whether or not Italy's a place for them to be, whether or not the current system is working for them as Italians. Now, to add to all of this, to just throw all this up in the air, we throw in that little event, which is the First World War. Now, this played a big part in creating problems for liberal Italy, whether it's the anger created by it, the fear, the expectations, that creates more problems again. So what was the anger? Well, firstly, the anger over the mutilated victory. At the end of the day, Italy was on the winning side in the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles, the Treaty of Trianon, they all stripped land from the losing side and gave that land to the winning side. However, what happened with Italy is those supposed territorial gains, particularly Austria, Italia Redenta, were not given to them because the League of Nations self-determination principle meant that Austria in particular was allowed to remain as Austria and not just pushed in as part of Italy. So this made many view the government as weak, and the fascists even claimed that although the government had won the war, they had lost the peace. They'd lost that peace settlement. Furthermore, people were angry at the industrialists, who seemed to make huge amounts of money out of the war, but didn't even fight in it. And that money, as we've seen, wasn't being redistributed between North and South, so it wasn't people then feeling they were using that money to ultimately improve things back home for us. And that creates anger, and anger is a bad thing for any government. Fears, deep-seated fears are really important this time as well, right? Fear of a socialist revolution. In 1917, if you're doing option 8, you'll have seen this in Russia, or will see it in Russia, the Soviet Revolution. So, in the 2 years that follow the First World War, Biennio Rosso took place. A kind of a fear that the rise of socialism was coming, that socialism was going to take over. They claimed to have 200,000 members, and they claimed to control many of the prefects and councils throughout Italy. It creates that fear in people. They looked to Russia and they saw the violence of the civil war in Russia, and they're thinking that is coming to Italy. Now, in all honesty, the actual threat was pretty low, but the fear of it was great, and that's almost more important. The socialists were disorganised, but their potential, their numbers, bred that fear, and that is almost more damaging, more problematic for that liberal Italy government. And lastly, expectations. People had expected an enlarged Italy, taking land from Austria and its northern border, settled under that Treaty of Saint-Germain. People hoped for a revitalised Italy that listened to its returning fighters from the First World War, and that new ideas they brought might be incorporated. And the return of over 2 million soldiers from that war was hoped would provide greater land for them, new powers in the workplace. Surely, after fighting in that war for the very survival of Italy, they deserved those kind of things. Surely. Very quickly, to test your knowledge, have a think. Fear of communism was called what? Was it the Red Scare, Biennio Rosso, or the Communist Plot? It was Biennio Rosso, B. In what year did Italy have full male suffrage, every male able to vote? Was it A, 1917, B, 1918, or C, 1990? B, 1918. Italians were the what? Were they the lowest taxed in Europe? Not taxed at all, or the highest taxed in Europe? C, the highest tax in Europe. So there are your problems of the liberal Italy. Karen, are there any questions for me so far?
Hi Andrew, no questions at the moment, but if there are any, if you could put them in the chat function and perhaps we can return to them at the end of your presentation.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. Chuck any questions in the chat function and I'll answer them for sure. So, what you see, people are unhappy with liberal Italy. What do? They turn to other ideas of running the country, and one of those is fascism. Now, historians agree that there isn't really one definition of fascism. There's no one ideological text that tells you this is what they were. But they were united, really, by being very nationalistic, put Italy first, strongly anti-communist, kind of define themselves by being opposite to their enemy, anti-liberal, against individual rights. They emphasised military virtues. War was a good and natural thing, they felt. The leader was most important, and their style of rule was often control of the media, military, mass rallies, political symbols like the axe surrounded by the reeds, as you can see here, pinched, in fact, from the Roman times as well. So Mussolini, right? Mussolini, as a fascist, didn't really fare much better. He didn't really have this one binding overall ideology. Instead, he prioritised that sense of Italian national pride, as we saw, one of the big problems for the weakening Liberal government. He prioritised a hate of communism, and he also prioritised a hate for the old and weakening Liberal government and its failure to address many of the problems that people thought Italy had. So this is a quote from Mussolini in 1919, so 3 years before he came into power. He said, "Throughout the war, we heard of the incompetence of the people who govern and knew that if war was won, it was solely by the virtue of the Italian people. Therefore, we created the fasci. We alone have the right to succession because we were the men who forced the country into war and victory." Now, what he's saying there is he's saying that war is a catalyst for change. War is the thing that will change. War is the thing that will bring about new political governance. He used we. I can't even count how many times he used we in that, 3 sentences. He's trying to build that nationalist feeling there, isn't he? He's trying to suggest that it's we as Italian people, not you as people from the Duchy of Savoy, you people from the Republic of Venice, but we, people of Italy. And he's talking about succession, isn't he, right? He's talking about in Russia, a brand new regime. In Germany, a brand new regime. So if those many other regimes in Italy, in Europe have fallen, then why not the Italian state? Why not liberal government falling and a new thing like fascism coming in its place? So what he organised was a march on Rome, and this took place in October 1922. He came under huge pressure from his fascist fighting squads, as you can see here in their black shirts with their medals, their regalia, to gain force by power, or power by force, I should say. So on the night of the 27th, 28th of October 1922, fascist squads seized control in many towns and cities in Italy, and 30,000 prepared to march on Rome, the capital. Mussolini hoped that this would be a show of power and force a handover of power as well. And it's at this point that the attitude of that king, that one form of stability, is really, really important. He could, as commander-in-chief of the army, order the army to crush the fascists. Prime Minister Facta, he ensured that the army leaders were supportive of the Liberal government. And initially, the king gave the order to impose martial law. Facta took control of the army, and the army could use force to prevent the fascists coming to power. However, by 9 AM on the 28th of October, the king went back on his word, fearing that a civil war would happen between the black shirts and the army, and instead appointed Mussolini as prime minister. Now, Mussolini took power, as many had done, as leader of a coalition. He was the leader of the fascist, Catholics, right-wing, social democrat coalition. When he was appointed as prime minister, he was leading that coalition. But his first step towards a different path to those coming before him, those, for example, 13 prime ministers between 1900 and 1918, was he called for a vote of confidence in him in the parliament. He won it easily, 306 to 116 votes, and as a result, the king gave him dictatorial powers to restore order. So he's given him powers to restore order to prevent a civil war, which was going to be created by his black shirts in the first place. Doesn't make sense, but to Mussolini, it's perfect. It was initially set as a temporary measure, so people could think, well, it'll still return, it will return back to democracy any time now, but it didn't. Mussolini took advantage of it, setting up a private army, the MVSN, who took an oath to the state, not to the king. So no longer the king being seen as the commander-in-chief. And they had 300,000 members. This wasn't just like a small little group of ex-soldiers who were a bit annoyed. This was a huge number. Building on this, right? It's like he's building in confidence and confidence and confidence. The Anti-War electoral law he brought before Parliament, before the dictatorial powers were about due to run out in December 1923. The law stated that, providing a party won 25% of the votes, they'd then get 2/3 of the seats. There's nothing proportional about that at all. Now, in theory, it was to stop like weak governments, to stop 13 prime ministers in 18 years like we saw before the war. But in practice, it strengthened the fascists because in the election of April 1924, the fascists and its allies won 2/3 of the seats, and so they then had the majority, by far, majority of control in that parliament. Now, at the same time then, you've got people who are deeply worried about this. The critic, Giacomo Matteotti, he spent a lot of time building up evidence to the violence of the black shirts. And he made a speech in June 1924 outlining that violence to Parliament. And not long after, he was found dead. There was clear evidence that the fascists and the fascist leaders were involved, but again, the king refused to act. Who knows why? Maybe because he liked the idea of Mussolini leading a strong Italian nation. So in response, the deputies who disagreed with fascism set up what was called the Aventine Session. And this was sparked by another man, Ancona, his 40-minute speech outlining the crimes of fascism. Now, in some ways, this is a brilliant scenario for Mussolini, because all the deputies that disagreed with him have left the chamber, left Parliament, and gone and formed their own special chamber. So it means that there's no opposition left within Parliament for him. In 1925, he capitalised on that to introduce the Legge Fascistime, which imposed further press controls. He forbade Freemasonry. Local government was to be controlled by fascist-appointed podestas. And a January 1926 law made the Prime Minister head of state and only responsible to the King, not Parliament anymore. Only the King could dismiss him. And government by decree was introduced. This is where, essentially, when he writes down that's law, it becomes law. It doesn't have to be voted on by Parliament anymore. And this was used over the next 17 years to create 100,000 decree laws. 100,000 laws that only Mussolini had the power to create, not listening to the criticisms of other people in the Parliament. The final death knells were the May 1920 electoral law, which abolished the universal suffrage. It restricted voting to those of the age of 20 who paid taxes of more than 100 lira per year. Candidacy for an election had to be submitted first to the Grand Council, who would choose 400 names to put to the electorate. The electorate would vote as a whole. If they agreed with the 400 names, they'd go forward. If they disagreed with 400 names, back to the beginning, Grand Council would pick another 400 names. So it gave the fascist Grand Council massive power over this political process. And by 1930, Mussolini, or Il Duce, as he was now called, or as he now called himself, was unstoppable. So in that period of 8 years, he consolidated his power massively. Quick test of your knowledge. Whose speech sparked the Aventine Session? Was it Mussolini, was it Ancona, or was it Matteotti? I can tell you, it was Ancona. Second question. Did the March on Rome make Mussolini Italian Prime Minister? Is it yes, the violence was crucial in seizing power, or no, the king had already appointed him? Well, it's actually B. The king had already appointed him. Over fear of a civil war, he appointed him. Mussolini's private army, what was it called? MSVN, OVRA, Gestapo? I can tell you, it's the MSVN. Karen, have any more questions or any questions popped up?
Hi, Andrew. No, nothing at the moment.
No problem at all. We shall keep going then. So, what kind of country would Mussolini run? What kind of state would he want? What kind of lives would it be for the people in Italy? So what he wanted was a one nation bound by unity, common traditions, and not individuals. Not individuals dotted around, acting by themselves, but people bound by traditions, acting as one. The state's interests were put as most important, more important than individual rights and individual interests. And he explicitly referred to the fact he didn't want a democratic nation. He makes this quote, right? Denies the right, or democracy denies the right of numbers to govern by the means of periodical consultations. And if you take that out of context, it's got a good point. Surely we need elections every 5 years, every 1 year in order to have less periodical consultations than the 5 years we have. But what he actually means is take away the consultations altogether. Economics, he opposed trade unions. He agreed with the sentiments, but he didn't want trade unions. And he felt that war makes people most energetic. And you'll see that in his attempts to invade foreign countries, but also in his terming of things within Italy as battles, battle for grain, battle for lira, etc. Socially, what he said is the state is the educator, the lawgiver, the promoter of spiritual life. He rejected pacifism or non-violence as cowardly, rejects the idea of equality. He says people are looking for direction, all of which gives him credit, gives him acceptance to be a strong ruler. Religious and racial, he agreed with Catholicism, he wanted to defend and protect it, initially at least, because he needed to ensure their support because the priests and the church had so much sway over people's lives. And he said he wouldn't make his own religion, as many regimes did, like Robespierre in France following the French Revolution, etc. So what did Mussolini do? Well, he believed that the state would be one good way to both ensure the prestige of fascism and fashion an Italian nation, to make that Italy of the hearts. And his founding ideology was one of corporativism. Now, what that meant was it meant Mussolini saw it as a way to gain both economic and political power. It was seen as a solution to class warfare, right? Class warfare that the socialists, the communists were talking about. And as a solution to the disparate identities, a solution to people seeing themselves from the Republic of Savoy, the Duchy of Savoy, or the Republic of Venice, whilst acting as a bridge between the workers and employers in the interests of the country. Now, my question there is, who's defining the interests of the country, though? Is it Mussolini by himself? Oh, certainly. Mussolini's vision was to give business a moral conscience. It would see the closing down of trade unions, banning strikes, and banning lockouts of workers as well. Instead, fascist syndicates, he felt, would liaise between the workers and employers, and this is seen as a third way. It's not capitalism, it's not communism, it's corporativism, in the middle, kind of. So what was it like in practice? Well, it was first introduced in the Rocco Law of April 1926. And this recognised 7 branches of economic activity: industry, agriculture, internal transport, merchant marine, banking, commerce, and intellectual work. And these formed syndicates, groups to promote their interests, to represent the employer and the employee's interests, and decentralise control, take control away from central government. And these came under the Ministry of Corporation in 1926. However, they weren't really given actual power until 1938. And this is a big feature of Mussolini's Italy. He says one thing, does it actually happen in reality? A classic Mussolini's is he made the trains run on time. When you look at the facts, the cold hard facts, he didn't really make them run on time any more than anyone else. So ultimately, these branches of economic activity, they were seen as a way to also get rid of Parliament. There would be no need to consult deputies, their MPs, as consultation supposedly occurred between employers and employees. Now, as we'll see here, in order to make those economic decisions, you had to consult the national interests of the Ministry of Corporation and party officials, fascist party officials. You had to consult with employers, those who own and ran the factories, and you'd consult with employees, but crucially, you had to be a member of the fascist party to be an employee who could feed into that decision-making process. So when we're talking about who's defining the interests, it is almost certainly the fascist party, not Italian people as a whole. So specific things he did, well, he introduced large job creation schemes, right? Among the first economic measures introduced by Mussolini after taking power in 1922. The idea, quickly provide work for unemployed, improve transport and communication within the country, make the divide between north and south less by making it easier to travel between the two. Hundreds of miles of autostrada are done as part of this, and also electrification of the railway as well. And it would unite and connect those people in larger towns and cities. Hydroelectric power stations were also built as well in order to provide electricity and employment. Big employment schemes. Battle for grain. Note the term battle, right? Energy from war. Now this battle formed a central element for the drive of self-sufficiency, you'd say. Specifically in wheat, that main ingredient in pasta, bread dough, etc. They originally relied heavily on foreign imports of wheat. So he put high taxes on it to stop people trying to buy it from abroad. He provided grants to farmers to buy machinery and fertilizers to improve the crops. And output between 1922 and 1939 doubled. Success, I might hear you say. But it damaged other forms of agriculture, animals and wine, right? There was less people growing grapes to make wine. There was less pasture land for the animals. And with the rising price of grain, the Italian diet declined in quality. And brilliantly paradoxically, it actually increased reliance on imports of fertilizers from abroad. So they decreased reliance on imports of wheat in order to increase reliance on fertilizers. Battle for Lira in 1926 is another example of Mussolini's economic ambitions. As fascists consolidated power in the 1920s, Mussolini looked to become more involved in the economy. His aim, confirm the image of fascism as bringing stability while stamping his control on every and any element of Italian life. So the revaluation, the changing of the value of the currency of the lira from 90 lira to £1 from previously 100, was meant to strengthen its purchasing power abroad and stop price rises in Italy. But what it did do, paradoxically again, is it made it hard to sell Italian products abroad, particularly hard for the Italian car and textile industries that relied on those foreign markets to survive. If you've got poor people in the south of Italy, they're not buying Ferraris. It's the rich people in England, in Wales, in France that are buying the Ferraris instead. The Labour Charter, another key measure introduced, Carta del Lavoro, promised Italian workers social benefits in compensation for the loss of right to strike. The Labour Charter proclaimed that workers had to view work as a social duty to the state. It wasn't just something they did to earn money, it was a duty to the state. And in return, the state promised it would introduce high employment, social insurance, so against unemployment, and welfare benefits, including improved and extended maternity leave as well. It also provides additional pay for those in dangerous employment or working excessive hours. And it can be viewed as much more impressive than it was on paper than it actually was, because actually many of these people failed to get those promised benefits. They failed to get their dangerous work bonus. They failed to get their improved maternity insurance. But it looked good on paper, didn't it? Battle for land, or the Marshes. This battle was won, again phrased as a battle, note that use of the term in order to try and get people's energies up. The idea was to turn land, or marshland, into land that could be cultivated to grow crops. And laws on this were passed in 1928 and 1933. It also aimed, as a result, to provide more jobs, right? Impress foreign observers and, as a bit of an added bonus, reduce malaria. Mosquitoes hang around damp areas, so you get rid of the marshland, which will be less mosquitoes. And there was, like ever, massive success to some extent with the draining of the Pontine marshes near Rome. Thousands of new acres of land were created. Most of which, though, were lost in 1943 to 1945 due to neglect in the war. And actually, in some cases, it just increased mafia control in the south. Very little change in the ownership of the land, despite the aims of it. This resulted in many large landowners in the south blocking greater land reclamation and demonstrated their control over those local people still. It wasn't the fascist government controlling it, it was the large landowners, possibly even the mafia. And all of this was about achieving autarky, being self-sufficient to prevent the need to rely on others. So in the late 1950s, that need for national prestige, for nationalism, and preparations for war, militarism, increasingly dictated economic decisions. The aims of many of Mussolini's government's previous policies became clear through that policy of autarky. It was national self-sufficiency in terms of raw materials and resources, hence the battle for grain, hence the battle for land. And what it did is it posed strict limits on international trade to encourage as much as possible to be created inside Italy itself. And it brought with it more rigid controls and centralisation, especially of those heavy industries crucial for building the arms up for the First World War. Sorry, for the Second World War, as it would eventually be. So, another quick test of your knowledge. What does Mussolini feel? What does Mussolini feel war principally contributes to society? Conquest of land, energising the people, innovations in industry. Well, principally it's B, energising the people. What was the biggest paradox of the battle for grain? A, decreasing grain production. B, less pasta being eaten. Or C, increased reliance on foreign fertiliser. C, increased reliance on that foreign fertiliser. Employees feeding into a cooperative system must be members of what? Was it a trade union? Was it the Italian nation? Or was it of the fascist party? It's C, of the fascist party. Now, I think the last thing I'll do before I'll pause, and I've got more information than I can go through in this time. So in a second, I'll pause on each slide so you can stop the video, you can pause the video and read them to gain an oversight. But what I'll just talk to you briefly before I do that is about this, the cult of Mussolini. The cult of Mussolini was an attempt to portray Mussolini as the bringer of everything, bringer of life, bringer of food, etc. And he was very famous for starring in some very staged photos that tried to make him look even more superior and things like that. So the first one on the left here is Mussolini driving one of the first tractors bought under the battle for grain. You can see him looking up as if he's, in control of the machine, people waving flags behind him. This wasn't just him having a go, this was done for a purpose, to show him as driving the tractor. Second one then, Mussolini sowing wheat on the new Pontine Marshes. As he's sowing that wheat, he's making a point that his government have introduced this new land. Here we see Mussolini helping with the construction work in Rome itself. Again, in military uniform, right? Interesting, lots of these in military uniform. That association with war being the energizer of people. Again, in the middle, Mussolini surveying the building of an autostrada. And down the bottom, Mussolini participating in the first harvest of the grain on the Pontine Marshes as well. All these pictures trying to put Mussolini front and central in people's lives. So I'll just pause on each of these slides for you to read. Unfortunately, I haven't got time to go through them. Time has whizzed by, but just pause the video and then you can have a read of them as a summary then of these different periods of Italian foreign policy. Fascist centrality refers to the idea that they were trying to extend the length of time that Italy would be fascist, over 100 years at least. And I always use this with my students, right? Italy attempts war. Okay, attempts war, because the very famous quote from Churchill, Italy, the soft underbelly of Europe, right, seen as the weakness, and that's because it's attempting war. In fact, it initially felt it wasn't ready for war, so tried to put it off to 1943, didn't do it in the end because they thought they'd lose out, but still attempting war. Okay, so that is session 1, the story of Italy. Next week then we'll have a look at a review of a good essay on Italy. Just note then, on the following 2 weeks, Karen will be looking at Unit 2, starting with source skills for question 1, and then on the following week, on the 15th of February, looking at the interpretation skills in Unit 2, the question 2 element. So, are there any questions? A few minutes now just to check, ask them in the question and answer function, and I'll answer any questions you've got at all.
Hi Andrew, nothing in the chat function as of yet in the Q&A.
Okay, just give it one more minute and see if anyone's got any questions they're typing. If not, we'll leave it there. I take it there's no questions then, Karen?
No, nothing's come in, Andrew.
Okay, well, thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next week for session 2.